Welcome to Role-Playing History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 37, The History of Dice. I've been promising a YouTube exclusive on dice for a long time, and while that might still be a possibility, this week I decided to stop making you wait for it and instead bring you a podcast-friendly rundown on the history of dice, particularly as it pertains to role-playing games. So, as we get started, let's make sure we've got our definition clear. Dice are small, throwable objects with marked sides that can rest in multiple positions. They're used for generating random numbers, and this is done most frequently in board games, tabletop role-playing games, and casino dice games such as craps. So with our definition secure, let's get into the history of dice. Now, I will be getting into the history of dice in role-playing games because, come on, this is what the show's all about, but I'm just enough of a history nerd that I had to give you some basic history of dice before we got to that. Dice have been used longer than humans have been recording history, and for the record, historians and archaeologists have been unable to determine exactly where dice originated, who was responsible for them, and why somebody decided this was something humans needed. Of course, just because we don't know exactly where, when, and why they were created hasn't stopped some historians from putting their own theories out there. Among the most popular is that dice were a natural progression of fortune-telling. I mean, we use the term roll the bones for rolling dice. Well, in ancient times, fortune-tellers or soothsayers tossed actual freaking bones when they were telling fortunes. Sometimes they were the bones of hooved animals, sometimes the bones of chicken or other types of fowl. So maybe at some point somebody decided that rather than kill all these animals for the soothsayer, maybe we could just come up with something they could use that was a permanent item. We also know that ancient Egyptians played a game called Senet, which used flat two-sided throw sticks that indicated how many squares a player could move their pieces. For the record, Senet was a type of board game played as early as about 3100 BC through about the 2nd century AD. Archaeologists have been able to date dice found at Skara Brae, Scotland, from about 3100 to 2400 BC. It should also be noted that excavations from graves at Mohenjo-Daro, which is an Indus Valley civilization, found terracotta dice that were dated to 2500 to 1900 BC. All right, wait a minute. Terracotta dice? Now, those would be interesting to roll. Insofar as games involving dice, some are mentioned in the ancient Indian Rigveda, Atharvada, Mahabharata, and Buddhist games list. And in a reference I never thought I'd be making on this podcast, there are several biblical references to casting lots. Psalm 22 is one of these that comes to mind if you're wanting to fact-check me. What that tells us is that dice in games, and possibly games of chance, were somewhat commonplace when that psalm was written. Or it could literally mean that dice were used to choose positions for activities, much like a dice-off in modern game settings. Knucklebones was a game of skill that was played in ancient Greece. They often used literal bones, with each side marked with a value like dice. We'll assume for this that they would be the knuckle bones of some large-ish animal. Now, oftentimes when it comes to the history of something, we get a large amount of record from the Romans, because not only did they conquer a large chunk of the world, they also recorded damn near everything they did, which for us makes it easy to figure out why they did a lot of the things that they did. And yes, Romans loved them some dice. It should be noted for the record, though, that gambling was illegal in most parts of ancient Rome. That being said, most Romans were into alium ludere, which translates to play at dice. And there were two sizes of Roman dice. Tali were large four-sided dice with the numbers 1, 3, 4, and 6 marked on them. Tesserae were smaller six-sided dice, and they had the numbers 1 through 6 on them. There's a huge historical record for what each of these types of dice were used for, but since our focus is on role-playing games, we're going to leave that for another show. Oh, and just in case you thought 20-sided dice were a 20th century creation, 20-sided dice date back to Ptolemaic Egypt as early as the 2nd century BC, and in much of the rest of the world from about the 2nd century AD. So somebody needed a D20 for something that far back. Let's be honest, you and I would both shit if it came out that the Ptolemaic Egyptians were playing a role-playing game. But what kind of role-playing game would it be? I spent about 20 minutes trying to think of a funny name for a game from that time and came up zilch, so just at me if you've got a funny one, all right? I know that to this point I've focused on Egypt and Europe. Our friends in China and Japan also have a rich history with dice, and they were so in love with them, they developed new games as offshoots of the dice themselves. Dominoes and playing cards were actually developed first in China as the next evolution from dice. This took place during the Tang Dynasty, which ran from 618 to 907 AD. It also coincides with a major technological advancement, which was from rolls of manuscripts to block-printed books. The Japanese used dice to play a very popular game called Sugoroku. For the record, there are two types of Sugoroku. Ban Sugoroku is similar to backgammon and dates back to the Heian period, which was 794 to 1185. Then there's Sugoroku, which is a racing game. Wasn't able to find any additional information on either of those games that was in English, so for now, that's the best I can do. As always, however, if you've got more information on these games, hit me up and we'll expand on them in another episode. Regardless of the game, how we use dice is pretty much universal. We throw, toss, or gently roll them either from our hand or from a cup or another container. And we typically roll them either onto a hard surface, such as a table or a hard floor, or into some sort of box or other container with sides that stop them from rolling away. Dice towers are another method for rolling dice, of course, and they take the use of the hand pretty much out of the equation, other than to drop the die into the tower opening. Then, obviously, the dice are added or otherwise utilized to check for the result. Hopefully, you get the desired result when you roll. And finally, just because I couldn't help myself, here's the technical names for the shapes of the most commonly used dice in role-playing games. 4-siders are tetrahedron. 6, that's easy, they're cubes. 8, octahedron. 10, pentagonal trapezoidahedron. Try saying that 3 times real quick, I dare you. 12, dodecahedron. 20, icosahedron. Okay, you should probably actually be able to say those a little quicker than I did, but piss on it, that's complicated. Most of us got our first introductions to dice with 6-siders, since they're still the most commonly used dice in the world. I mean, games from Yahtzee to Monopoly utilize them. And if I'm being honest, I stole a ton of 6-siders from my family games when I first started role-playing, so I'd have enough dice to look cool. Come on, don't tell me I'm the only one that did that. Alright, okay, jerk move. I hear you. So we've looked at where dice came from. Now let's get into the history of them in a role-playing sense. Of course, to do that, we're going to have to look back at the past time that was the inspiration for role-playing games. And those of you who've been with us since episode 1 know what that is. Miniature wargaming. By the way, I'm using information from that show as well as from playingattheworld.blogspot.com for some of this, just so we're being honest about where all the information is coming from. So if you'll think back to that very first episode, I mentioned that Prussian wargamers back in the early 19th century were the first to have what we would now call combat resolution tables. In other words, they had charts with possible results on them, which necessitated some way to determine what result would come to pass. So they brought in the dice. 6-sided dice, to be exact. In fact, 6-siders were the prominent dice used in miniature wargaming for well over a century. As Playing at the World noted in their article, other than a few experiments with D12s in the late 19th century, 6-siders were the prominent dice used until about the 1970s. I mean, hell, when Avalon Hill helped to launch the modern wargaming scene in the 1950s, they stuck with the tried, true, and easy-to-find 6-siders. Again, going back to the Playing at the World article, they noted that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, new, more elaborate charts and tables were being devised for wargaming, and they required different dice. After all, if you're setting up charts that have a percentage chance of something happening, you really can't work percentages with 6-sided dice. That's where the 20-siders came into play. But wait, I hear you saying, how does having 1 to 20 on a die help with percentages? Oh, young Padawan, the D20s of that period of time were not marked that way. As the article notes, the D20s these wargamers were using had 0 to 9 on the dice twice. Therefore, you could roll 2 of them and have a percentage, much like we do today with D10s. Oh, and how did we get to having the dice the way we have them now for sets? Again, and I am so glad I found this article in my research, Playing at the World notes that before about 1972, you couldn't really find D20s in the US. They were sold mainly in Japan and the UK. So before that time, most wargamers would either shell out a crapload of money to have some imported, or they'd make them out of cardboard or some other material. However, in 1972, an American supplier of D20s was discovered, but the dice came with a catch. Don Lowry was his name, and he only sold his dice in batches of 5, one each of D20, D6, D4, D8, and D12. So because of that, other miniature wargamers began to work up ways to use these dice in their wargames. And a fellow by the name of Gary Gygax was among the wargamers writing articles about their usage in the wargame field. I'll also bet that even though his name wasn't mentioned in any of the articles I read for this, one Dave Arneson was also very well aware of those dice, because he was also a miniature wargamer at the same time. So we know how those 5 dice came into gaming, since Gygax and Arneson produced Dungeons & Dragons, which we all recognize as the first tabletop role-playing game. But what about the D10? How did it get into the picture? Well, in November of 1980, Game Science began advertising their brand new die invention, the D10. In 1981, the Moldvay Basic Set included a D10 in it. This was the first time a D10 was included as a part of the basic set of dice, and it brought the number of dice for role-playing games to 6. In the years since, D&D adopted it, and companies like White Wolf based their gameplay around it. Of course, the D6 still has its special place in gamers' hearts as well. West End Games' D6 system is still used by gamers around the world and is especially popular with fans of the Star Wars system that they put out in the 1980s. Oh, yeah, one more die to mention for D&D fans. Game Science announced in 1990 that they'd created the first percentile die. Marked 00 to 90, it allowed for genuine percentile rolls when paired with a D10. Chessex announced their percentile die about 4 months later, and it's been noted that they developed theirs independent of Game Science. So for some, the basic set of dice is 7. However, I would note that percentile dice aren't really necessary because you can just use 2d10 for a percentile roll. And I've seen dice as large as D100, but trying to get one of those to stop rolling so you can see it is an absolute pain in the ass. So other than as a novelty item, I have no clue why you'd want one. Okay, so we've looked at some dice history. Now, who actually makes these things? Look, these days there's a ton of dice companies out there, each with types of dice produced to be different than what everybody else is doing. However, for the sake of history, let's talk about the 2 companies I mentioned in the history list above, Game Science and Chessex. We'll start with Game Science. The company was founded in 1974 by Lou Zocchi and is headquartered in Bardstown, Kentucky. While the company has dipped its toes into the game production realm multiple times over the years, what they're known best for is dice. As I mentioned a moment ago, Game Science developed the first commercial D10 as well as the first commercial percentile die. While they still crank out the occasional rules for war games or small-ish role-playing games, dice continue to be their biggest seller. A check out their website, dicedepot.com, shows they've got dice of all shapes, sizes, and colors, and they've even partnered with companies outside the U.S. to import other dice for sale. While Game Science may not be the best known company, they are among the oldest, and I was always taught to respect my elders, so we're going to give them their props on today's show. Now, Chessex is a name I'll bet pretty much all of you have heard of before. I mean, chances are if you go to your friendly local neighborhood game shop, at least in the US, the dice they're going to be selling are going to be Chessex dice. Founded in 1987, Chessex is headquartered in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Much like Game Science, Chessex has also dipped its toes into the game publishing waters a time or two, but they merged that part of their business with The Armory in 1988 and formed Alliance Game Distributors. Nowadays, Chessex is all about the dice. And when what I consider a unique move, if you head to their website, chessex.com, one of the very first things you'll see is a notice from the company strongly urging you to purchase from your local retailer rather than their website. I have to admit, in this modern world of me first, it was kind of refreshing to see them do that. But if you don't have a local retailer for dice, they're more than happy to show you the selection. And trust me, they make a lot of dice. My preference, if I'm not buying one of their plastic cube with a matching set of dice, is to buy their pound of dice. It is literally a pound of random dice in a plastic bag. You never know what all you're going to get, but you can rest assured you're going to have a load of dice for your next game. And by the way, if you're part of a new group and a bunch of you need dice, I'd recommend chipping in for the pound of dice. It should work out really, really well for you. But like I said, Game Science and Chessex aren't the only names in the dice game. Companies like Awesome Dice, Skull Splitter Dice, and Norse Foundry are producing different types of dice for gamers to use. Just type in game dice companies into Google and see how many names pop up. I'd also note Norse Foundries specializes in making metal dice. Yep, in the past 5 or 6 years, metal dice have started becoming more and more popular. And yes, there are more companies than just Norse Foundry doing that. There's a number of theories why metal dice are becoming more popular. Some feel it's because metal dice are harder to wear out than resin dice. While that's true, metal dice will also require a die box for rolling. Otherwise, you're liable to scratch or break the table you're rolling on. Believe me, I own a couple of sets of metal dice, and those bad boys are heavy. The other theory, just straight up, is because they're cool and different. And that's true in a lot of ways. I mean, you can do a lot of cool colors with resin and epoxy, but there's something about the look of a metal die you just cannot top with any other method. Now, that being said, I only own 2 sets of metal dice. All of my others are traditional, and it can be argued that a large majority of them are just in plain, boring colors. But that's on me. Oh, and I know that some of you out there are the do-it-yourself types. Well, there's a growing industry in that as well. You can purchase resin molds for dice either online or at hobby shops pretty much anywhere. All you need then are resin and colors for the resin. My friend Monica pointed out to me that you can use cheap makeup powder, like what you can buy at discount stores like Dollar Tree, to color your dice without spending a fortune. All you need then is a little free time, a bit of free space, and some patience. And with that, you can make your own dice for your game. Maybe I'll do a make-your-own-dice YouTube video since I stole the dice show for the podcast. Of course, it's not just about dice anymore. There's a growing section of the industry that's devoting itself to producing accessories for your dice. Now, when I started, the only die accessory we had was a Crown Royal bag, and that was if you were lucky enough to either have a parent who drank Crown Royal or a friend who had an extra bag you could get. Otherwise, you just had to come up with options. And I mean, over the years, I've had friends make dice bags for me, and I still have all of them, though I don't really use them much anymore. Because I am at heart still a Crown Royal bag guy. Sorry, not sorry. But if you're looking for more than that, companies like Wormwood Gaming create dice holders out of all types of wood that are not only functional, but they are miniature works of art. Fans of Critical Role should be familiar with Wormwood, as they were a sponsor of the show for quite some time during the second campaign. And if you've got a few extra bucks lying around, I'd highly recommend checking them out. Their stuff really is nice. They're not the only company out there doing this, though. Again, type in some game dice accessories in a Google search, and you'll get dozens of companies making everything from dice holders and carriers to dice trays to dice towers to dice rolling boxes. I mean, I've got a dice tower that I got for my birthday. It's a cheaper, more like balsa wood kind of deal, but it's really cool. All of them are really cool to look at, and most of them are pretty cost effective if you break it down. And for you to do it yourself, there's a ton of YouTube videos out there you could follow to make your own accessories. Just punch in what you want to learn about and follow along. I personally use a couple of felt-lined portable dice trays that snap together for use, then fold them down flat and put them in my backpack to transport. You can get those for about $10 US at your local game store. Look, regardless of where you buy your dice, what you carry them in, or what you use to roll them, dice are as important to a tabletop role-playing game as the rules of the game are. They've been ingrained in the process since D&D was invented, and even though some games have come along that don't need dice, sacrilegious, dice in games aren't going anywhere. And with that, we come to the end of today's tour. I know today's episode is a bit shorter than usual, and I apologize for that. When I first wrote this, I fully intended for it to be a YouTube exclusive, so I was figuring time for showing off dice and, showing off some of the accessories I own, and we didn't do that. However, due to the family issue I mentioned in last week's episode, I'm batch recording 3 weeks worth of shows at once, so I needed an extra show for the podcast. Since I'd already written this and was just waiting for a good time to video it, I decided to grab the script, make a couple of adjustments, and record it for the podcast. I hope you still enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed researching and writing it. And as I mentioned last week, we'll be deep diving R.A. Salvatore and Ed Greenwood next week, and that will hopefully buy me the time I need to get my family illness situation resolved and the research completed for the diversity episode, which I'm hoping to run in 2 weeks. Fingers crossed. As always, the music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. If you're looking for really good royalty-free music for your presentation, I can't think of a better place to look. I want to thank you for your continued support and patience as my personal life continues to intrude on the production of this podcast. I am endeavoring to continue to bring you new shows each and every week, and your response to those shows motivates me to keep on keeping on, regardless of the obstacles I have to work around. So thanks for your listening, and thanks for continuing to believe in what we're building here. You can follow us on Facebook, Roleplaying History Podcast, Twitter at RoleplayingP, YouTube, Roleplaying History Podcast. You know the drill. Email roleplayinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so next week we're going to look at the 2 biggest names in the history of the Forgotten Realms, at least from the creative standpoint, R.A. Salvatore and Ed Greenwood. This one's going to be fun, so don't miss it. But that's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History.